Winifred's work on human rights activism is a model of engaged scholarship. As a senior fellow at the Washington office on Latin America, WOLA, she not only conducted research on the Colombian situation, she was actively involved in educating policymakers, leading delegations, and promoting an alternative agenda for U.S. policy towards Colombia and Latin America in general. Winifred has been able to show that the abstractions of policy are but one factor in the construction of human rights as a social endeavor. Of equal or even greater weight are the social relations that evolve between activists, officials, soldiers, and community members.
What I'm going to be talking about today is the ways in which discourses and narratives about the role of paramilitary forces in the Colombian conflict contributed to particular expressions of state formation and public policy in Colombia and in Washington. And the narratives that I'm talking about located these paramilitary forces as the expression of middle-class political frustration with non-functioning democracy, with government incompetence, and located these paramilitary forces as the central agents of effective counterinsurgency efforts, legitimizing their violence and allowing them to be recognized as political actors within Colombia, and positioning them as autonomous forces for Washington actors who were interested in establishing greater alliances with the Colombian military forces. So I'm interested in how these narratives were produced and circulated and what their political effects were. So I look at media accounts, websites, think tanks, interviews with paramilitary leaders and Washington officials, which is what I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit, for those of you who don't know, the history of paramilitaries, and I'm talking about their most recent incarnation, paramilitary forces. These are illegal armed actors that work with the Colombian military. Elements of it go back a long time in Colombian history, but they, in the contemporary period, have kind of three major moments. Kind of death squad operations in the 1970s, their dramatic expansion in the 1980s, tied with drug traffickers, and the role of land consolidation during that period was fundamental to this. But I'm really focused in the mid-1990s, efforts to consolidate a national paramilitary project that emerged, particularly with the 1997 creation of the AUC, the National Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. And at this point, we see a qualitative and quantitative shift in paramilitary forces. So the numbers expand dramatically. And in part, this is made possible because the paramilitary leadership that emerges are the kind of second-rank drug traffickers that were left after the Cali and Medellin cartels were dismantled. So they're moving into these leadership positions. And there is emerging a very charismatic leader, Carlos Castaño, at the time, who had a very direct political project. It was one of the central factors in articulating both this national coordinating structure, but also the political agenda. Saying that they were the victims, they had sacrificed their own personal security, their domestic life to defend the nation, but they were the victors. Unlike the ineffective, corrupt, and weak Colombian military, they had actually been successful in pushing the guerrillas out of many regions of Colombia. In this narrative, the paramilitary forces define themselves as an independent force ready to step into the vacuum left by an absent state. And for many Colombians, including the rural elite and the urban middle class, and this was key for the president's, the support of the hardline president that was in power during this time, Álvaro Uribe. These narratives resonated with their directed experience and their projected fears of growing guerrilla military power that was also happening during this time. So Mancuso told me the story. He's the son of Italian immigrants, a cattle rancher from the Atlantic coast of Colombia. And he told the story of how he got involved in the paramilitaries by coming into the organization and undergoing a personal transformation from just another member of the community to a leader of these forces. and the institutional transformation that the paramilitaries went to become what he called a parallel state. And not only a parallel state, but a more effective state. One of the things that I've been doing is using declassified documents and interviews with military officials who were active in South Com at the time. And their story about paramilitaries is that there are several narratives they developed. The Colombian military is out there. Who are they going to kill? The guerrillas who are attacking them, or the paramilitaries who are attacking the guerrillas? And so this idea that the paramilitaries were simply a natural response to violence and were not actually a fundamental part of the conflict. And I'll just conclude briefly by talking about the narratives that circulate about paramilitaries and the conflict. In southern Colombia, which is an area I've been doing a lot of field work in Putumayo, which was during this period one of the many areas that experienced intense violence from guerrillas and paramilitaries. It was the epicenter of Plan Colombia during this period, the push into southern Colombia. And talking to people about how they understood this tremendously brutal, very spectacular rise in violence during this time, there were a number of responses. And one is the kind of classic push for legal redress that's promoted by human rights groups. So individuals saying, we need to know what happened to our family members. We want justice in these individual cases, which is important and has been a central part of the story that they tell. But another story they tell is what they call the Faustian bargain, and the way, well, they talk about coca as the cursed leaf, a Faustian bargain in which by participating in the coca economy, the cocaine production and trade, they articulated a diffuse sense of culpability within these communities, that this is what happens when you get involved in illicit economies. This kind of violence was brought into the community by our decision to participate in this illicit economy. But at the same time, they extended that sense of culpability to bring in the United States and say, but not through necessarily the military programs that the U.S. was sponsoring, but through U.S. consumption of drugs, and talking about this as a market relationship. We're producing what people in the United States want, and we would not do it if they did not want it. And so the U.S. consumers need to take some of their responsibility. At the same time, these narratives circulated through Washington in a way that legitimated and naturalized U.S. support for the Colombian military by erasing their role in drug trafficking, erasing their links to the Colombian military, and positioning them as marginal but natural actors in the conflict who would eventually die away once the U.S. elevated the Colombian military to a sufficiently professional and capable force. With this story about how Putumayan communities articulate these different senses of culpability and responsibility, because I think it's important to bring in the voices from the people in these communities and the ways in which they were understanding both the role of the coca economy, but also bringing in U.S., not simply policymakers, but consumers into these discussions of culpability and responsibility, as people have tried to puzzle out how we understand this incredibly violent period in Colombian history.
So there are very impressive sources and extensive fieldwork. It would be wonderful if you could actually comment on your fieldwork in the discussion.
So a lot of it is the political moment, kind of having these windows of opportunity where you can go in and talk to people. But this is why I've been thinking about it as discursive practices and narratives, because it hasn't had the kind of sustained fieldwork that I've been able to do at other times.
In Washington, the state, the politicians, and all the official electeds over there, they see what's going on really between not only the horror of the situation with the paras, what happened with economic policies that was implemented in Colombia. Everybody is very happy with these policies. The government in Washington, they see this situation?
In terms of the degree to which that and these other economic issues are visible in Washington, I think there is a whole debate around the free trade agreement for Colombia in which people are very clear about, well, arguing very, very strongly about how neoliberal policies are positive for the United States and positive for Colombia. There's been a big push for that. Certainly they're not linking that to the paramilitary violence in the stories that people are telling about those policies and projects.
Well, thank you very much, Winifred.
Yeah.